All right. So first, I would like to start by thanking you all for joining us today in this panel discussion. My name is Tracy Dow, and I am the coordinator for the Conflict Medicine program at the Global Health Institute at the American University of Beirut. I am happy to welcome you all today to our panel discussion, where we will be looking into the realities of treating war injuries or injured patients from war zones from the lens of surgeons on the battlefield. So it is my pleasure to welcome our esteemed panelists for today, Dr. Graham Groom, Dr. Ahmed Al-Mukhallalati, Dr. Nada Al-Hadisi, and Dr. Hassan Nahouli, who will be sharing with us their unique stories, their unique experiences, and their insights from the recent wars on Lebanon and on Gaza. So thanks again for joining us today. Our session will be moderated by Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, who is the founder and the director of the Conflict Medicine program at the Global Health Institute. Dr. Ghassan, I know how busy your schedule usually is, so thanks a lot for joining us today. So as a brief, thank you, Doctor. So as a brief introduction on Dr. Ghassan, he is a plastic and reconstructive surgeon with over 30 years of experience in conflict medicine. He specializes in complex trauma and reconstructive surgery, and he has been on the front line of many wars in the MENA region, including to name a few, the first and second Intifada in Gaza, the 2018 and the 2014 Gaza wars, the Great March of Return, and most recently, the Lebanon and the Gaza war. He was also at the front line of many other wars in the region, such as Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and others. So before I leave it to you, Dr. Ghassan, I would just like to invite everyone to leave their questions in the chat box, and we will be addressing them at the end of the session. So thank you all again for joining us today, and Dr. Ghassan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tracy. And first of all, I'd like to thank my friends and colleagues, the panelists, for agreeing to take the time. I think this is a kind of conversation that, despite the fact that the war is still and the genocide is still ongoing in Gaza, despite the fact that the ceasefire in Lebanon is extremely fragile, to say the least, it's critical for us to try to understand what it is that we have learned from the last 14 months in terms of the treatment and the provision of care for the war wounded in these two wars, and to see what we are able to learn together, taking forward this kind of knowledge and this treatment. And so we are very fortunate to have all of you agree to join us. For those who don't know, Dr. Ahmed Mukhallalati is the head of plastic surgery at Shifa Hospital in Gaza, and is currently a consultant plastic and reconstructive surgeon at St. Thomas's in London. I had the honor of working under Dr. Mukhallalati during the summer of 23, and then during the war in Gaza. His leadership in the short time that it was prior to the war really was able to embed in the plastic surgery department a lot of the things that actually are what's carrying plastic surgery in Gaza till this moment, despite the horrific losses of two of our colleagues, Dr. Ahmed Makhadme, who was executed by the Israelis in Shifa during the second attack, and Dr. Midhat Saidam, who was killed before when his house was bombed, and Tamer, who was one of the burns nurses at the burns unit and the head of the physiotherapy at the burns unit, who was also killed. Our second panelist is Dr. Graham Groom, who co-chairs Ideals and has been pioneering complex limb reconstruction both at King's College and then in Gaza following the 2014 wars and in the Ukraine, And really, his experience is unique, not just as a provider of healthcare in war and complex healthcare and complex reconstruction, but as someone who, from the very beginning, prioritized training and capacity building and made it a precondition to all humanitarian intervention. Dr. Nada Hadithi is a plastic and reconstructive surgeon with whom I've worked in Lebanon during this war, and with whom I have cooperated during several of the wars. And I am very keen to hear from Nada as a newcomer to the field, but also as someone who has who was instrumental in setting up the plastic surgery residency program in Gaza in the 9 months leading up to this war. And then we have Dr. Hassan Nahouli, and Dr. Hassan Nahouli is an orthopedic surgeon who was trained at the American University in Beirut and who has been very active during this war in the treatment of the war wounded. And I'm keen to hear from him as someone who received his training in a place that emphasized conflict-related injuries as part of the disease load that its trainees will be needing to deal with. And therefore, his perspective as someone who has had the closest to what you could call a bespoke training when it comes to dealing with this kind of complex trauma. So I would like to start with Dr. Mkhallalati, and if we can have Dr. Mkhallalati really kind of take us through some of the points that he wants to raise and share with the rest of us.
Thanks a lot, everyone, for the great efforts, and thanks for trying to share as much as possible of this experience. Sam, thanks for the nice and humble introduction. Actually, I had the pleasure to have your support while starting plastic surgery training program. And I had the pleasure and the big support from your side and during the first kind of 1.5 months in the war, working together in the same hospital and backing me up and helping me in the decision making and just passing it through the very difficult experience of this war. So that was a pleasure. That was a great support. I will be always grateful for that one. And I know how much of risk have you taken to be beside us, and the same thing coming to Lebanon in this time and just being part of this treatment. It was not something you were surprised having it. You were expecting that. I remember the discussion, and you said, "I'm going there, waiting for them," because unfortunately they will be coming to Lebanon as well. Hopefully, this ceasefire would just continue. Won't be something fragile and but unfortunately, it doesn't look like something that's stable. One of the I won't mention a lot of numbers because everyone knows what's happening. I just want to highlight a few things. The first gush of mass casualty patients arrived to the emergency department of Shifa Hospital around 11 o'clock in the morning on October 7th, were around 500 patients. Most of them explosive injuries and kind of airstrikes with very aggressive way. And we literally had a total collapse of the system, especially the emergency department, which was counted one of the biggest, I consider the biggest in Palestine and one of the biggest in the area, but was unable to deal with this big number of patients. So it's literally very difficult, very hard experience when it comes to the reality. And I went there at that time. There was no space for you to walk between the patients. That was around 400 bed capacity emergency department, adding to this the shortest stay. But actually, it was unable to deal with that because the patients with their families, there was no cannulas at that time, no chest tube. The number of nurses, doctors were not enough at all to deal with this one. So it's a really big, big challenge. And it took the health system of Shifa 2-3 hours to stand again. And that was by the help of everyone else as an initiative. So the first experience was sorted out not by the managerial rules or the strategic planning or emergency plan. It was the healthcare worker who took this on their own responsibility And the nurses and doctors from the wards, the medicine, the surgery, they were taking 20, 30 patients to their bed wards and start treating them on the ward, on the ground, because they have cannulas there, they have chest tubes. That was the only way we were able to survive the first few hours of the attack. So it's again, nothing would work on the ground. I remember me talking to the head of director of planning in the ministry and say, "What is your planning?" He said, the worst plan we thought of is getting 150 patients to the emergency. That was a plan done with the help of MSF, ICRC, and everyone else. But again, it didn't work. So it's again, a lot of the challenges is not something simple to deal with. And one of the other things, imagine this will be kind of back logged in everything. So the emergency department will be full, then the wards will be full, then the recovery in operating theaters will be full, and then you get everything blocked, like consequently. So you need to take bigger actions rather than, the simple ones. And that only happens if there is someone actively involved in the ground trying to work on this thing. If you leave it, nothing would work, no plans. So again, it's the health work leaders at these institutes or like country who would take the lead to make like a plan as you go thing and try to evacuate the hospital as much as you can. The other big challenge of Gaza is usually in natural disasters. You could have gotten someone evacuating the patients, support from doctors from outside or anything. It didn't happen at all. So we realized with time that this is our own issue. No one is coming for help. No one is coming to support us. We know hundreds of people are outside waiting to support, but they were not allowed in. So you need to consider at early stage that this is your own problem. This is your own issue. You need to sort out yourself. No one is helping you in that one. And I think that was one of the secrets of Gaza health system not collapsing and surviving that much of attacks on the system. Just a snapshot of what was happening by the end of October, more than 150 patients of burn, half of them more than 50% burns. ICU expanded from 20 beds to 70 bed capacity. 18 operating theaters were working day and night full. There was no space for any of the not elective, the semi-urgent cases. We had to work on circumstances where if you ask for any surgery day 2 or day 3, if it's not life-saving, you won't get space at all. Then we had the patients in the recovery area full and waiting for space to get in the wards, and then there was nothing. And then we had to close one of the main operating theaters, like 6 operating theaters in the surgical specialty area. So number one, I decided and I told the ministry, I see this issue needs the plastic surgery services to be able to discharge more and more patients. And we agreed that I will start operating in the burn theater with minimal support from the anesthesia side. It was only anesthesia technician, almost no nurses on one volunteer nurse to help us. And then I couldn't get full support, but I said I need to start discharging the patient. I need to start closing the wounds. And that was how we started, proper plastic surgeries when there was no space at all. We got isolated environment for the plastic surgeons, and we were operating on 10 to 15 patients per day till 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock early in the morning. That was one of the ways of evacuating and just discharging the patient from the hospital. So if the health leaders are not aware of this point, they will never get this issue done. So they need to consider plastic surgery as a very vital and important role. The second thing which comes there, plastic surgeons can't work without orthopedic surgeons. If they don't have orthopedic surgeon dedicated to the orthoplastic approach, it doesn't work at all. That's kind of a policy making thing rather than a personal experience thing. We had at one point 2,500 patients in Shifa Hospital. Out of these were 1,500 orthopedic surgeon patients. And these 1,500 orthopedic patients, I'm sure 1,000 of them needed plastic surgery as well. So if we don't understand this percentage of casualties, it doesn't work. The other thing, I had myself unable to do follow-up and round on 500 plastic surgery patients. So I had to ask help from the director of the hospital, Dr. Abu Silmiya, who's a real leader, Then I said, listen, the patients are dying because I can't see them. So the second thing was seeing who of the specialties had space or capacity to help us. And we got help from the medicine department to do the rounds on the patients with the critical burns, because we had no way else of doing electrolytes, regular input and output charts for fluids, and then kind of respiratory support on ourselves. So I had to rely on the other specialties. And they had, again, the initiative to support me fully with them doing the rounds. So every day in the morning, I would give them 70 patients, 100 patients with burn injuries, and they need to do the rounds on these ones. The other very critical important thing, which based on the limited of resources, everyone knows what happened in Gaza. I won't repeat these things, but there was limited electricity, no supplies. We were under full siege. We had nothing coming new to the hospital, so we had to manage with whatever left in the area. Added to this, they start targeting the stores, the ways to the hospitals. So we were left with isolated hospitals, not providing a lot of care. So I remember Dr. Jihad Jaidi, the chairman of ICUs, called me and said, I have a patient with severe burn down to the bone of both lower limbs. If this patient needs to be taken care of, I need you to amputate both limbs, above knee amputation. Then I said, I think that's crazy. He said, that's the only way for this patient to survive. And that was very early in the first week. And he told me, now we don't have ICU support as used to be before. We are losing a lot of patients because I can't provide you with ICU support. I can provide very minimal basic support only. So you need to consider this. The patients are dying because of lack of services, because of lack of laboratories, because of lack of CT scan. The queue for CT scan head was sometimes 2-3 hours. By the time you reach the CT scan, the patient is dead already. So he said, amputate this. And then the patient refused the amputation. And then he unfortunately died 2-3 days later. And then with time, we realized any patient above than 50% burn, they will not survive. They will not make it at all. That's sad to say it, but that should have been picked early. And we made something called a black area with agreements. It was a decision on the ground taken by me, the head of ICU department, the head of emergency department, and Dr. Ghassan was with us in that one. And we said anyone with above than 50% burn, they will take a lot of resources. They need regular theater access. ICU bed was not available. So whatever you do to them, you can't save them, unfortunately. So you need to have the wisdom and to take this decision. But the other challenge, we couldn't tell this to any of the families. So you need to do it in a wise way, because if you tell any of the families who lost 10 members that the other one who just here with 70% burn will die in 2 weeks' time, that would be a disaster. They won't let you. So we didn't tell anybody about that one. That was like a decision at the managerial level. One of the other challenges later when I moved to the European Gaza Hospital was the lack of medical staff. We had no medical staff in the area. I had to upgrade the medical students to make them fully functioning doctors after a lot of training. And the training was happening during the wartime. I was doing every day briefing in the morning, debriefing in the evening. Our last time of the day was around 9 o'clock or something like this late in the day. So sometimes up to midnight, we do debriefing. And every week, every Tuesday, I used to have teaching sessions for them to teach them what to do. And then there was a graded supervision, which became in the least things after 2-3 months. So these people, by the end of this, we were doing rounds on 500 patients again in European Gaza Hospital, daily dressing on the patients, giving conscious sedation in the wards. They were working with their staff, dressing staff. They had pulse oximeter. I brought for them portable ones. They had the conscious sedation set up, and they were doing this on their own with one doctor supervising them. That took me a lot of efforts to train them, but that was the only way to deal with 500 plastic surgery patients by one plastic surgeon in European Gaza Hospital. So the challenges were really, really big. The other one, which I would really want to mention, at the personal experience, you should have some expectations of how much you need to do, sacrificing the patient's limb for their life, sacrificing some patients' life for others who have better chances of survival. You should accept this early in the wartime, because if it takes you along, then you are losing a lot of lives because of this inflexibility you have. So again, it took me a while, I'll be honest with you, because I moved from London with totally relaxed environment. We're following the highest standards. We never felt that I will have lack of ICUs or lack of antibiotics or anything. But I had to do this, okay? And it took me a few weeks, okay? Thanks to Gassan was around. I was really lucky having someone who has the experience. But at the personal level, it takes you a lot. Now I'm much, much more mature in decision making for saving lives rather than sticking my head and saving the limb. And one of the big challenges you have to understand is the psychological element on the patient side. The patients, many times, they've lost everyone. They won't be able to take a proper decision. So very little comment or let me say a superficial opinion of like a random surgeon who would say, oh, you know, we can't save this limb. This means the patient, the family will refuse the amputation, which would cost them the life of the child or the life of the patient. So you need to tell your colleagues to be really cautious about their opinions, unless it's really proper opinion, solid one, based on an MDT thing. Amputation decision is not something to mention while walking. It's something which has to follow at least 2 or 3 surgeons' opinion, because the patient's family will just stick to your opinion, which doesn't make any sense, doesn't have any scientific background. But then it happened many times that we lost the patient's life because of these opinions. I want to take longer than this, but I remember Muhammad was one of the orthopedic limb reconstruction surgeons, was one of the really good ones who got training in Gaza, and he had been exposed to a lot of limb reconstruction cases. He was working with MSF Belgium. Unfortunately, he was arrested the last time they went into the north area, and he's now arrested. We don't know anything about him. We'll see him again. We are really worried about him. The resilience of people is the most important part of this, maintaining the health system. I talked to him. He said we ran out of the clips for external fixator. I went to the engineering department and I got something to work instead of the clips. So he managed to do something locally, and he was happy that he continued services. The same thing, I was writing a paper the moment I left Gaza in June. I felt I need to do something. I called him to give me his opinion about like the approach in the wartime. And he insisted to give a proper opinion. He recorded more than 20 minutes of his opinion, extensive opinion. So the people resilience and the amount of hope they have is very important to keep it in the middle of this very difficult situation. He insisted to give me proper comprehensive approach to his limb reconstruction orthopedic side of this one. The last thing, the health system of Gaza was meant for it to collapse fully. At one point, we had no major hospital working in Gaza at all. That's May, June, July. The international organizations helped little, but they were sometimes part of the bigger genocide picture by giving you the relaxed atmosphere of them providing services in the south of Gaza, for example, and then a single phone call would come from the Israeli side that you need to leave the place, and then you leave Gaza and south of Gaza without any of this. They were not all the same way, but unfortunately, they were not some of the reliable resources for you to rely on. Finally, it was only us, the health system in Gaza. They started rebuilding the health system, thanks to the Ministry of Health, Dr. Yusuf Abrish, who is the person with all of this strategic planning and strategic thinking and a lot of efforts. He never gave up. He never say it's enough. He had the system collapse twice fully. He kept rebuilding it. The 36 hospitals of Gaza, at one point, they were targeted at least once, and they were out of service at least once, maybe not 3 or 4 times. But we got again, like 2 months ago, we had all the hospitals working again, except in Najjar hospital. Now they targeted the north of Gaza hospitals. So we keep rebuilding. They attack the hospital, we rebuild them. But just finally, it's only the resilience of the people who own the land will be the only way of resisting this genocide. They targeted the health system to a level that the safe hospitals became the most dangerous places in Gaza. The health workers who were supposed to be the peaceful people working in the humanitarian sectors, which is totally protected, became targets on their own. And we had many times where wearing the scrubs or wearing the coat means that you are a target, and you need sometimes to think many times of leaving these scrubs on you or not, because you will be targeted only being a health worker. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ahmed, for that sobering intervention. So I'd like us to move to Dr. Graham Groom. Graham, if you can share with us your thoughts.
I'll unmute myself and then I have a better chance of sharing my thoughts. First of all, I'd like to thank you for having me, and I'd particularly like to salute both Ahmed Mokhlolati and Ghassan Abusita. Both of them have been under fire, literally and metaphorically, and they command my greatest respect. I think Ahmed has not really told you about the detail of what it was like to work at Shifa Hospital during the invasion, when the IDF were within the hospital interrogating him, what they required of him. I think that's another story altogether, and Ghassan has similar stories. In contrast, mine is my story is much less dramatic. What I've been asked to do is to give some idea of the context of the conflict, because we've seen a number of wars, the context of the conflict in Gaza, in Lebanon, but I'm not going to talk about Lebanon, and how it differs from other war zones. Could I just finish off by commenting what Ahmed said about the first day of the war and the 500 patients and a master plan for a maximum of 50. There was a terrible day on the 14th of May 2018 when we were visiting Shifa Hospital with two colleagues, and between 2 p.m. and 10 p.m. there were 160 admissions with gunshot wounds, and that's not a day we'd forget. I don't know any hospital in the world that could cope with that adequately. And on that day, we simply admired the discipline and professionalism of our Palestinian colleagues. And I think that's important for me to say. The very final point of the introduction is that when we first started going to Gaza in 2009, we knew Ahmed's father, who was a wonderful person, then Minister of Health, and Ahmed is clearly a chip off the old block. His father would be immensely proud. So what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit. I've been doing some arithmetic, and since I qualified, I've been involved in treating the wounded of 14 wars, conflicts, civil disturbances, and 1 earthquake. And if we put all the casualties of those conflicts together, they would be far fewer in number and much less in the horrifying nature than this present war. Gaza, for those who do not know its immediate history, since 2009, when the first major conflict happened, has been the subject of 8 major conflicts. By major conflict, I mean those that the IDF has given a name to. And we're talking about Cast Lead in 2008, 2009, and then all the way through to the present one. You may not know it, but they call it Operation Swords of Iron. Now, if we think about the first 7 conflicts, they're listed as though there was a significant break between them. There was a break, but casualty flow was continuous. If we think about the total casualty figures for the first 7 added together, we're talking about 4,238 dead, according to the WHO, and 44,000 and a few more wounded. You probably know the latest casualty figures for this present conflict. There are 44,000 killed and nearly 105,000 wounded. If we think about the context of how that's happened, and we think about the destructive and explosive power that has been dropped on this tiny area, 42 kilometers from north to south and an average of about 8 kilometers from east to west, perhaps a little bit more. In the first year, more than 75,000 tons equivalent of TNT was dropped on it. Now, no one could imagine that, but the only comparison perhaps is of the atomic bombs. The atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was 15,000 kilotons, 15,000 equivalent, and on Nagasaki 25,000. In other words, the atomic bombs were approximately average 20,000 tons of TNT explosive equivalents. In other words, the equivalent of 4 atomic bombs has been dropped on Gaza in the first year. And that is an unbelievable figure, certainly as far as I'm concerned. I think in terms of casualty figures, there are very important things to consider. And the first are the number of the ones we know about but can't count, the ones that are buried under the rubble. Who knows what that final figure will be? And the second and most important thing are the number of excess deaths that will occur as a consequence of the conflict. Now, they've been estimated by a project between the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and the Centre for Humanitarian Health at Johns Hopkins University. In February, that's nearly a year ago, it's certainly 9 months ago, they estimated that if there was then an immediate ceasefire, there'd be 6,500 excess deaths. And those would be from all the other effects of war: lack of medicine, lack of medical facilities, lack of food, lack of light, exposure to the elements. There would be those excess deaths. That's if there was a ceasefire then in February. By August this year, as there wasn't a ceasefire, they estimated that there'd be between a little more than 58,000 and 74,000 excess deaths if there was no epidemic. Well, epidemic disease follows war as night follows day. And their estimate is with an epidemic, and of course there is epidemic disease of all sorts, 66, but somewhere between 66,700 and 85,750 deaths. Those are the excess deaths, which are not casualties, who are not wounded, who are not bombed or shelled. Those are the excess deaths within Gaza as a consequence of the disruption. And I think it's not unreasonable to imagine that at the end of this war, there will be 300,000 dead and wounded as a consequence, which is, it's 14% of the entire population of Gaza before the war, although it's smaller now than it was. And what about the facilities? We're talking about context here. What about the facilities for treating these people? Well, in 2023, last year, there were 3,500 hospital beds. If you want a good source of data, I would thoroughly recommend the Norwegian, I'll find it somewhere, the Norwegian Refugee Council figures. If you're after numbers, there is a useful resource. So 3,500 beds in 2023, and now there may be 1,500 remaining. Now, if we compare cities of similar size in more prosperous parts of the world, well, Gaza would be prosperous if it wasn't constantly attacked. But in cities of similar size, they have 5 to 8 times more hospital beds than there were in Gaza last year before the war. And I think that's, and then of course, we get on to issues, context, we get on to issues of access, equipment, medical supplies, food, water, sanitation, shelter. I don't know if you've been watching the news recently, or if you've been to that part of the world, Gaza is wonderful for most of the year, but in winter it is wet, cold, and if you have no shelter, that in itself will be a huge cause of excess mortality. From our point of view, the context also involves access. Before October last year, our group, I should have said that I co-chair a little charity called Ideals, which has been active in Gaza since 2009. Focus has been treatment, training, building capacity, and delivering equipment. And we've done that with a model of humanitarian intervention of frequent short visits, constant touch with video conferences between visits, and sticking at it. And we've been doing it intensively since 2014, and we've had many visits. Before October last year, we would travel via Ben Gurion, and through Erez, and we would be allowed in or not, with equipment or not, as the case may be, through an organization part of the IDF called Koget. After October, we traveled through Cairo, across the Sinai, and through Rafah. When Rafah has been closed, the route now is from Amman through Allenby Bridge and through Kerem Shalom crossing. Now, the humanitarian aid, you'd see that it's humanitarian organizations consistently say that it's being rationed, and the ration is consistently denied. Well, I can tell you that as far as we're concerned, we've been able to, when we travel through Erez, we could travel in unrestricted numbers and take as much equipment as would be delivered as we could carry. And over the years, we've delivered more than $3 million worth of surgical equipment. Through Sinai, when we came under the aegis of the United Nations, and we traveled in convoy with them, we were restricted. We had very few restrictions on numbers of humanitarian aid workers and very few restrictions on the equipment as long as we could carry it. Now we come from Amman, we are hugely restricted in the number of people we can take and the amount of equipment. And the hot news, which other people on this panel may not have heard last week, 4 days ago, our Norwegian partners, Norwag, were told that by Koget that they would allow no equipment to be transferred to the terrorist hospitals, by which they mean the Ministry of Health hospitals. So that's the latest news on that front. I could go on the entire hour just about the context and how we approach it and how we seek. Our role is to support our Palestinian colleagues. Our role is to turn up, to to do what we can, and importantly, not to make things worse. And that's something I'd be very happy to discuss. I'm just coming to the end of my 15 minutes. A gallop through context. I hope some of it has been relevant, but I particularly want to thank and congratulate Ghassan for organising and Ahmed and both of them for their superb efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. And I think we will touch on this at the end, but I certainly believe that if there's any one thing that I have learned from the war in Gaza, is that the only thing that is genocide proof is training and education and building up people's skills. And I have witnessed the work that Ideals has done and the way that knowledge then permeated through the system in Gaza, and that it was critical for the continued functioning of the health system. Those individuals that Ahmed spoke about, so many of them were either trained by Ideals in orthopedics or trained by trainers who were in turn trained by Ideals. And I think that is one of the messages that needs to go out from this horrid experience, is that the difference between medical solidarity and saviorism is that medical solidarity in the form of capacity building and training empowers the local health workers who do carry the overwhelming majority of the burden. So I'll move on to Nada Hadithi and ask Nada to share with us her perspective as a newcomer to this to war surgery and to humanitarian work, both in the field and as a trainer. So Nada, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And it's been absolutely fascinating to listen to Graham and Ahmed so far. And I just want to reflect on the fact that Ahmed had to make so many difficult decisions, which we would never, ever be expected to make in this country as doctors in that capacity. And I just cannot imagine what you must have been through to do that, Ahmed. So it's just so much respect for you and Ghassan and everyone who's been out in this conflict. So thank you very much for having me, Ghassan. And I am very much an imposter here, and I'm grateful to be able to talk to you all. My story comes from when I was 11 years old. Sui Chayang was a family friend, and she would tell us stories about her experiences in Sabra and Shatila, and the massacre that happened there when she was an SHO. And that degree of storytelling was one of her greatest tools, because it was always, Nada, you must remember the Palestinians are your friends. And I always came to the Palestinian cause that I'm working in solidarity with colleagues and peers and friends. And therefore, when the opportunity came to work in medical education with Ghassan and to help support the program for plastic surgery FRCS training or board equivalents, I jumped at it because I've been a supporter of the cause for many years. Now, the question I was asked to cover was how, in the context of conflict, would you say there are unique practice adaptations for microsurgery, burn care, aesthetics, and what challenges and innovations, and strategies have been developed in order to try and improve healthcare in this context. So recently, we were in Lebanon trying to set up the Turkish trauma hospital with multiple other NGOs, so UK Med Global, MSF, MAP, and Interburns. And there were multiple teams of NGOs from all over the world who were some very, very experienced and some new to conflict medicine. And we were all working within different roles. And part of my remit was getting theatres up and running to receive mass casualties. And so the work that we did for this was to really understand what might come through the door and anticipate eventualities so that we were ready. And part of that would be getting the kit ready. And certainly for burns, that's something that is essential and necessary. And then came the question about microsurgery. Now in the UK, if you do microsurgery, it can take, 8 hours, 12 hours, a whole day operating list to get one case done. And it made me think very carefully, going back to Ahmed's point about would it be appropriate to be doing a free flap to salvage a limb when there are 40 patients outside bleeding to death? Probably not. And therefore, you're in a predicament where there needs to be senior leadership and conversations around what the offer can be and what the resource is available. And it very quickly comes to a case of how many theatres do we have? How many surgeons do we have? How many admitting staff do we have? How many nurses do we have? How much blood do we have? And, in Lebanon, we were much better resourced than they have been in Gaza. But the thing that was very prevalent was the human capital, the knowledge and the expertise, and the intention to share that. And certainly, that was part of the reason why we were so keen to offer the training program in Gaza so that there are plastic surgeons who are able to make MDT decisions with their orthopedic colleagues and all the other specialities we work with, in order to try and get the best possible outcome in the quickest possible way with the low resources available. So I think probably microsurgery wouldn't be for immediate conflict care, although in certain instances there might be flaps that can be done without the use of a microscope. And I think the other thing just to remember is that the strategy of building upon the resilience, the strategy of education builds on the resilience of the local population. And without the Gazans, without the Palestinians' resilience and their determination for their human right to live, none of these contributions we're making would mean anything. And that's something that time and time again I've been completely humbled by, the infallible attitude of my Palestinian colleagues who have taught me so much in this experience. So I feel that I'll probably hand back at that point because I feel very much like an imposter because I've only been in Gaza a couple of times and I have worked in Bethlehem and other places, but certainly not in conflict the way Graham and Ahmed have. And my background's more in education and sort of building systems.
Thank you very much, Nada, and I think we'll pick up this conversation because I think the aim of all of this is to really kind of try to come out with a couple of lessons learned and seeing how we can learn from these. So, Dr. Hassan Nahouli, I'd be very interested in seeing your perspective as someone who was trained in conflict medicine by the very nature of where you trained, and then over the last couple of years being a independent operator as an attending orthopedic surgeon, how you found this experience, which is your first war as an attending surgeon, and how do you reflect back on the kind of training that you had, and how do you feel that you need to be that the system needs to move forward?
Thank you, Dr. Abu Sitta, and thank you, Tracy, for organizing this webinar. And I'm honored to be here between you. And I'd like to share my side of the story. So to add a bit of background, so I'm the graduate of the American University of Beirut. I've lived through the Beirut blast, which I think was one of these situations where we had to deal with a gush of 500 cases running into the ER or to the ER, and then managing these cases. I lived through that where we had to treat these patients over a span of a week through all our operating rooms and services. So having said that, I'll start by the pager experience that we lived in Lebanon, and I think that was unique and that's not very common to see. So I was around the hospital, and it was an afternoon where most surgeons and doctors were leaving hospitals. And I got a call from the director of the hospital at Labib Medical Center in Saida, which is one of the biggest hospitals in the south, I think the gate of the south, Saida. And he said, I need you now. And I was lucky to be in 2 minutes away from the hospital. So I rushed there, and I saw the similar situation to the Beirut blast thing. So that was like a flashback. Bodies all over the hospitals, people and patients running around with sheets of blood. And I think what made that day better was that everybody was down on the floor, from clerks to surgeons to directors of the hospital, helping out and solving this disaster. And I remember the directing telling me, take these patients and do whatever you need. The operating room is under your service, and let's start moving on. I'll be triaging the patients, sending people. He converted the floors to triage areas where they started allocating patients based on the severity of this thing. And we started moving on with these cases. And for 3 to 4 days, we were able to deal with these cases. And the majority of these cases had, if not all, had hand injuries because there was a lag between the pager ring and the blast. So most patients had their pagers in their hand and looking at them. So most of these patients, around 4,000 in Lebanon, suffered from hand injuries. We're talking about multiple digit amputations or soft tissue losses, in addition to ophthalmic problems. Some of the patients had thigh injuries where their pager was left in their pockets, with leaving a big hole in the thigh, and sometimes with open fractures, sometimes with abdominal injuries, and all that. I think we had tough 3 to 4 days. Each surgeon had like 10 to 15 cases with at least a bilateral hand injury to deal with from the orthopedic side of view. And I think the system was definitely overloaded. And from an orthopedic standpoint, we didn't need much more than a loop, but from an ophthalmic point of view, they needed the microscope, they needed to do more surgery, and that's limited in the biggest hospitals. So if all these patients, 4,000 patients, needed an ophthalmo to treat them, that was a very big limitation. So, but I think overall, from what I saw at Labib, that in Lebanon in general, they have a disaster plan, although things go out of hand, but they're always ready to adjust. And what I saw from the people was incredible. An incident I don't forget, that one of the nurses who used to work at Labib 10 years ago, he was here in vacation. Once he heard about the incident, he was there in the operating room with us helping out, and he said, I'm here vacation, but I'll be where I can help. So that was something to see. This is what keeps us going forward. And I stayed in this country because I love it. So and I was here to help all these people, and I think from my part, I tried to do the best I can. Now, that aside, the pager incident is different from the war injuries that we dealt with in Lebanon. And the picture in Lebanon is a bit different to what Dr. Ahmed described in Gaza. I don't think we reached the place where we had the total collapse of our system, and we were still able to function at a high level. Now, to start with, I will start with what we have done with Tracy and Tia before that, and Dr. Ghassan. We did a big study about the 2006 war in Lebanon, and that gave us a pretty good idea of how and what are the kinds of injuries that we encounter. And the most common types of injuries in war are limb injuries by far, be it soft tissue or bone fractures. And it's very important to be able to deal with these injuries, and for people and surgeons who are practicing in this country to have a very good training in order to deal with these injuries. And I think AUB has done a fantastic job in that sense. So in terms of how we managed these cases, so if you'd say Saida is one of the last southern city that was fully functioning during the war. So what we were doing, we were accepting cases that were coming from the southern hospitals that were dealing with life-saving stuff, and we were accepting the big, complicated cases like difficult reconstructions, difficult fractures to manage, and we were able to manage these cases. And I think there was a very nice facilitated way of transferring the patients to our hospitals and having the ministry cover for everything. And we had all the green light to operate and get the equipment we need. And we didn't reach a stage, although we had a plan if we reached an end stage where we couldn't operate, to do high level of surgery to these patients. And I'll give a few examples at the end. So in that sense, I definitely thank everybody from the ministry down to the clerks of the hospitals who sacrificed a lot in order for us to accomplish that. And also saw that high level of readiness also at the hospital, Kisarwen Medical Center, where I operate in the north, where they dealt with few of the bombings that went over there, and they handled the cases with full expertise. They also had some drills for disaster managing plans. So I think we were ready in a sense, and everybody was ready to sacrifice in order to solve these problems. Now, I'd like to touch also base on one thing, also a very big project with Dr. Ghassan and Tracy and Tia, that is the orthoplastic paper in Gaza. And that paper showed that paper, by the way, had the biggest known published or unpublished pool of patients with open tibia fractures due to gunshot injuries. So we're talking about Gastelum type 3A at least in these patients. And we've found that having a plastic service in big defects definitely improves outcome, especially in terms of union and bone healing and soft tissue healing. So in that sense, I'd like to add one thing that I think AUB is trying to incorporate, and Dr. Ghassan is a leader in that, is that to train orthopedic surgeons on two things. And to start with is to have a touch and feel of some of the plastic techniques that an orthopedic surgeon can do. And that's because a lot of times a plastic surgeon might not be available. We'd love for them to be available, but reality is that in a lot of cases, all hospitals or situations, we might not have a plastic surgeon, and vice versa as well. So incorporating into our training the basics of some plastic approaches to big defects, especially in areas like our area where we're in a conflict area and we never know what will happen, is of utmost importance. And I was trained on that by Dr. Ghassan and the Department of Plastics at AUB, and by our orthopedic surgeons who have a big experience in that. And I'd say that helped in a huge part. And I'd like to encourage that more and more. And the second thing is that I don't think conflict medicine is something elective anymore for training in a conflict setting like Lebanon. I think it's a mandatory to be incorporated in any medical personnel who is to be trained and wishes to work in this area. And finally, I'd like to share a few things that of the cases that went through and we dealt with through the war and the pager incident. I don't know if you could see my slides. I'll run through them. They're just quick cases. So you can see this is one of the pager patients. We can see if circled here for the audience, the femur fracture, and we can see through the x-ray where the arrow points the huge defect. That picture is after the massive debridement. So the most important thing is debriding these patients. You can see I applied the fixator for that. I'm going to show you that these complex cases were dealt with in our hospital at Labib Medical Center at a high level. So these are what was removed from his thigh. This is the fixator, good reduction. a couple of more debridements. We can see the defects closing. After a vac we had the luxury to have a vac applied, good granulation, skin grafting, bloster, and we can see things getting better and better and better. And this is, I think, one of the easiest cases that we had in hand during the pager events. And I think the aftermath of the pagers is not as easy as the war, because hand surgery is also a very subspecialized field, but we managed to help these patients through their at least primary procedures, and in few patients through the definitive surgeries. This is a kid where we can see his elbow shattered. It was an open fracture, multiple fragmented distal humerus. This is in no way a joke. And he also had his proximal humerus in the same side shattered. You could see how the head of the humerus also collapsed. And he had an amputated toes, and he also had the same hand finger fracture, multiple fractures. So you could see, due to the open nature of the fracture, wires were my only go-to. I could gather the humerus back, distal humerus in place, and this we could see post-operatively, he's healing fine. And for his proximal humerus, I had the luxury to do this surgery with a great outcome. We can see here, this kid seen after a couple of weeks doing an amazing job, moving his shoulders and elbow. Last but not least, this is something I've learned, and these patients who stay under the rubber for a long period of time could be missed. So this patient was transferred after staying under for like 16, 17 hours, and he went to a small hospital in the south who transferred him, and they only reported his femur fracture. I waited for him till midnight and saw him, and I saw his compartment syndrome. And do not be shy to open these compartments. We were able to save his limb, and thankfully he still has some function in his hand. And in a couple of days, I managed to rotate his skin, the dorsal part volarly, and then add a skin graft to close his defects. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hassan, and thank you for sharing that with us. And I think your story highlights the fact that there needs to be specific training, or there needs to be an integration of war surgery, conflict medicine into the training curricula of doctors working in these parts of the world where, as a result of the geopolitical fault line, war injuries are almost like an endemic disease. So what I would like to basically do is highlight a few points and then put them to the panel to discuss. First of all, that the other side, the darker side of what we saw in the pagers and in the war, is that there is still people, colleagues who close blast injury wounds, who still go into internal fixation in the first go, who still treat blast injuries and war-related injuries as if they are a road traffic accident or a civilian trauma. And I think after over 30 years, if not more, of ICRC and MSF running war surgery courses, we need to accept that these courses are coming too late in the careers of some people to make the kind of change that we need. One of the things that we've been trying to do at the Global Health Institute, and we will continue to advocate, is that in places like Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Sudan, Somalia, that conflict medicine is taught at the undergraduate level with those principles that we all ascribe to becoming enshrined within undergraduate education, so that people's knowledge is built at the beginning and not fixed towards the end of their training or even after they're fully trained. The second point that I'd like to put out is the targeting of hospitals. So one of the biggest improvements, and I think that was based on the marches of return, biggest improvement in Lebanon, is that there was a trauma pathway health service that was set up. And so in the south, there were trauma stabilization points, and then patients were then sent to a field hospital, and then they were sent to a frontline hospital, and then they came to doctors and surgeons like Hassan, and then to Beirut for reconstructive surgery. And what happened is during this war, which is identical to but not as severe as the Gaza template, as Gaza is the Gaza template. Israel targeted the trauma stabilization points, killing paramedics and doctors, targeted the field hospitals, killing paramedics and doctors, targeted the ambulance men, killing over 100 of them, and then targeted some of the hospitals in Beirut, really taking out almost 500 beds from circulation and around 40 to 50 operating. And Nada witnessed us working in really kind of difficult conditions when all of the hospitals were sent to one of the governmental hospitals that was basically had been left neglected until this war. And so we need to figure out mechanisms by which not just us as health providers become much more prepared to become mobile. And during this war, I was covering 4 hospitals and operating in 4 hospitals during a single week, because after the damage that was done to big chunks of the health system, the patients were actually everywhere. And not all the hospitals had all of the equipment. And so we would travel from one hospital to another to do the kind of plastic surgery procedures to treat the patient. And therefore, what Ahmed had described in severity in Gaza happened to a lesser extent in Lebanon, i.e. the need to continuously consult with your colleagues and to adjust your practice based on the reality on the ground. And I believe, unfortunately, particularly the large humanitarian organizations, the ICRCs, the MSFs, have failed to grasp that, have failed to understand that the chaos of war is exactly what it means, chaos. And therefore, rigidity in expecting the patients to fit through the round hole, even if they are a square peg, does not work. So, and that's one of the reasons why we have seen organizations like Ideals, organizations like Palestine Children's Relief Fund, smaller organizations becoming much more effective in these conflicts because they are more agile. One of the worrying things is then, and what we've seen with other organizations, is that as they get bigger, they feel the need to become more like the big humanitarian organizations. And that's the biggest problem that we face, is that agility is lost as organizations see aim to become bigger. This lack of agility also, and I'm very keen to hear from Graham about this, is that the overwhelming majority of survivors in these bombings have musculoskeletal injury. And we still are facing humanitarian organizations that do not include plastic and orthopedic surgeons in their team. And still believe that there's some magical dinosaur-like individual who's that 70s a general surgeon who's able to put the external fixator, do the skin graft, open an abdomen, do a burr hole, like they existed in the wars of the 70s. And so these organizations are unable to provide the kind of care that they need. And then the last one is trying to understand this horrible, horrible phenomena in Gaza, which is how do you, as a surgeon, operate in the presence of the triad of death: injury, malnutrition, and hypothermia. And our colleague Nick Maynard pointed out that towards the end, he was having severe wound dehiscences that were not related to infection, but were related to the fact that his patients were injured when they were malnourished and became even more malnourished. And so this is, I will leave that to the panel to answer whichever of these points that they want. And we'll start with Graham.
Thanks so much, Ghassan. I was very interested to hear both Dr. Nader and Dr. Hassan. I think that was very interesting and inspiring. So thank you for that. I think the perhaps one of the really important issues is what you should provide for humanitarian aid. What is needed? What is necessary? When our first trip during the war was in December, and my co-chair audited the patients from the theatre operating logbooks and confirmed what everybody might think they know, but nobody responds to, is that 80% of the patients passing through the theatres in a typical week in the European Gaza hospital in November 2023 were orthoplastic. They had limb injuries, they required input from orthopedic and plastic surgeons. And we repeated that in March, April, and got the same result. I think that, and that contrasted quite starkly with what was provided. A partner organization from the past came with no orthopedic surgeons, no plastic surgeons, a general surgeon, an obstetrician. I'm very happy about the obstetrician because women go on having babies and they can run into trouble. But they brought a group of people for wash, water, sanitation, hygiene. Well, those people can't work at all unless they can travel. And if they can't travel, they can't work. And so that what we saw a lot in the early days was NGOs spending a lot of money and resources on inappropriate support. So thank you, Ghassan. I'm completely with you on that one. I've forgotten what the next point was. Does anybody else, while I struggle to remember, does anyone else want to pitch in? The other thing that struck me, if I make 2 points, first about what Dr. Nader had to say, is that she admires the resilience of the Palestinian population. A colleague and I were in Gaza for the month of August, so that the Palestinians have been under this most appalling attack for 10 months. And if ever we had a conversation about resilience and our admiration for it, the response was, we're not interested in being seen as resilient. We want the bombing to stop, or we want to be killed. That was their view. This has to stop. And if it doesn't stop, we'd rather be dead. The second thing is, and of course, it followed on from the first point, that the study of the war in Lebanon and of course the studies from Gaza reinforced the point, if it needed to be made at all, that aid should be directed at need and not provided on the basis of what is currently available. I think those are sort of the 3 points I'd like to make. Does anyone else want to chip in? I can.
Ahmed and Nada and Hassan, do you have anything to add? Ahmed, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm with you. Actually, if you allow me, Hassan, that's really interesting to hear the orthoplastic thing. And to be honest, it's a lot of ideas which comes to your mind that 15 minutes are not enough at all to say anything. But I would emphasize on the point that most of the time, so I had to do orthopedic procedures for most of my stay in Gaza. Out of the 8 months, at least 5 months, I was doing orthopedic complex procedures even. And thanks to being at King's College where we do the morning meeting, orthoplastic trauma meeting, and then I remember like Edmund Fitzgerald O'Connor, the lead in plastic in lower limb reconstruction, was always discussing and challenging the decision of the orthopedic colleagues. And then when I asked him why is that, he said, we should work together and understand the options they have, and they should understand our options, so we reach to the best treatment for the sake of the patient care. And he said, you should understand, and they should understand our part as well. In Gaza, I had to do orthopedic and plastics. Mohammed Ubaid, who was in the north of Gaza, for 10 months, he was the solo limb reconstruction surgeon doing both plastic and orthopedic procedure. I remember myself calling him regularly and trying to, he was expert to be honest, but just I said some ideas about the flaps or the design of the flaps. And then I was really, really happy that he was able to do that thing. And then I would see any trauma surgeon who should be really working in full competent way in the orthoplastic limb reconstruction part. That's a very important thing. And understanding the principles of both should be in both areas. I would add to this one the proper debridement, especially with X-ray guidance, helps a lot because many times you find like shrapnel or foreign body within the wound, which you don't see in the usual cell. And sometimes you have to dig deep to find that one. Unless you have X-ray in the theater, you won't get that one. I insisted in EJH to have always C-arm in my room, despite being a plastic room, because I understand this is a very important thing. The other thing I would say for the orthoplastic training, Mr. Graham Grom, who's the humble guy with us here, he is the one who started the limb reconstruction as an idea, as science, as experience, and he managed to encourage at least Mahmoud Matar to start considering this as a career. And then many people now doing the limb reconstruction in a fully, let me say, professional, high standard services. And I believe they have very extensive experience compared to anyone else in the area and maybe in the world, especially with the Great March of Britain and now the war. So the amount of experience they had is always should be really linked to someone who came from outside to tell the people what does it mean, this limb reconstruction. And they have this vision a while ago to start doing this one. And the same thing happened to the plastic surgery department and training. So Ghassan, Nada, Tim Goodacre, and a group of many people believed in the plastic surgery service, that it should be encouraged and should be a culture in the area. So that's why they were coming regularly trying to improve this one. The last thing, I believe any orthopedic surgeon in a hot area should be trained fully limb reconstruction. That should be their most experienced part, not anything else. We will have a time. I'm really sorry, but the area will be hot for a long time. We should consider this, okay? We should understand that I have this vision always, but I didn't have enough time to do that. I had the pleasure of preparing the first national orthoplastic meeting with Mr. Igrom with us. I wanted to do and spread the culture of limb reconstruction between both orthopedic and plastic. So we have at least 10 surgeons who can do the same job, orthopedic part and plastic part. So we save the limbs, or maybe we save lives instead of limbs, or just wasting the patient life because we thought that we can save that limb. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Nada, is there anything that you want to add?
Yes, we had this exact conversation in Lebanon recently with Tom Potokar from Interburns, and obviously he's got a lot of experience in implementation of change of practice in conflict settings, and he had the same frustrations, and we've seen it time and time again, where patients are having wounds closed when they shouldn't be or inadequately debrided, maybe with the wrong support or the wrong expertise or with the wrong equipment. Um, and Tom's perspective was that there's a lack, there needs to be a whole sort of culture change around this, and having, thought leaders in getting key people engaged in the process and that disseminating top down, but also bottom up from undergraduate level is going to allow that to happen. And it's still not always happening in the UK. Even though we know we have BAT-Press BOA guidance on this, there's still some places where things aren't being done to the same level and quality that you would expect. So the culture piece is essential. The other thing is, and that's not only with the staff or the clinicians, it's also with the nurses and it's with the patients as well. There needs to be social acceptance that your wound is going to be left open. It doesn't mean it's unfinished because we can't finish it. It means we're deliberately leaving it open to allow the badness out, to allow any further shrapnel to migrate, to re-X-ray after the debridement if we don't have the opportunity to have C-arm in theatre or to get an ultrasound again, whatever it is that's required. And then the second reason is the resource. I think when there's mass casualties, there's a lot of fear that there isn't going to be the capacity to bring those patients back multiple times. And, you could potentially be putting them in a worse situation with an open wound, which could potentially get infected. And again, you don't need a vac. And this is something which is education, but also culture. You can just put a simple Inidine dressing on and it will be fine. And you can bring them back in 2-3 days or when able. And dressings could be changed on the ward. You don't have to get into theatre. And closing it is far more detrimental than leaving it open. And third of all, these are Tom's points, by the way. It was the hope. We know 80% of them are going to lead to bone infection, osteomyelitis, and amputation or worse. And why close them? But the argument would be, well, one or two of them do okay, and they might be okay. So that element of hope, which I think is irresponsible personally, but those were the main drivers as he saw it.
So just to kind of, I mean, it's a different level, but of my current patients at the AUB, unfortunately, a 2-year-old had his upper limb amputation stump sutured primarily. That necrosed. That meant that part of the bone needed to be shortened a bit and added to the number of surgeries. His 13-year-old cousin had a degloving wound to her upper arm, also sutured. That became necrotic. That is added at least 3 to 4 weeks worth of debridements and vac to her dressing. So it is trying to enforce the idea that actually rather than reduce pressure on services, it adds on average between 5 to 7 surgeries when you inappropriately close a wound. It adds, other than the sepsis and the antibiotics, which is a driver of antimicrobial resistance in war, all of this. So that is why I'm going to end with this announcement that we were hoping that we will be running in January, end of January, a meeting on education in conflict medicine, accreditation, undergraduate, postgraduate training at the Global Health Institute. You will all be receiving your invitations, and hopefully things will be quiet enough for you to be able to come and visit us in Beirut for that conference. Thank you so much to all my friends. I always selectively invite people who I'd like to see because I don't have time to see them. And we will hopefully see you all soon in Beirut and the other side of Christmas. And if I don't see you before Christmas, have a good Christmas and a happy New Year. And hopefully our loved ones and our friends, Muhammad, Abed, are free, and this genocidal war in Gaza is over, and we are all able to meet again back in Gaza to help rebuild the health system and learn and teach the world from our Palestinian colleagues in Gaza what liberation medicine looks like. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for the participation.
Thank you, Ghassan, and thank you, colleagues. I've really enjoyed that. Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Tracy, is there anything else I need to add?
Yes, so I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Ghassan, and to all the panelists who shared their very interesting side of the story. I think we just have a few minutes left for questions and answers. I don't think we will be able to answer all the questions, but we can start with a couple. So one of the questions were, how are you able to follow up with the patients and make sure of their compliance to care plan throughout their displacement journey? Are you aware of any coordination among the different health facilities for that purpose?
So I won't answer that question, but I'll tell you one of the things that we had in Gaza that we then had in Lebanon, and we still do, but now a bit less now that the war has stopped, is that in war, the majority of your patients are injured when their homes are targeted, and therefore they have no homes for you to discharge them. And that's really the devastating thing. So one of the problems Ahmed and I faced early on in Gaza, before the complete collapse, is that we were just unable to get people out of their beds, to get new people in. And then I discovered that we were having the same problem with the patients in Lebanon, is that you couldn't send a child with an open wound to a center for the internally displaced. And so that's one of the biggest problems. I think one of the aims of one of the biggest projects that GHI is trying to get off the ground is for us to start adopting cloud-based electronic medical records during conflict, so that the patient's notes follow the patient rather than the patient follows their notes. And that's one of the issues we'll hopefully discuss in January.
But just if you allow me, sorry, just most of the patients, they don't get chance to be seen one more time. So that's one of the decision-making, let me say, main factors, not to do any surgery, which needs 2 or 3 stages. So I always tend to do primary shortening and start the healing of the bone and the flapping this as soon as possible, because I know the moment I'm thinking of bone graft or any kind of bone transport, it doesn't work in this. I have patients who stayed on the same frame or like X-Fix for more than a year now. So this is a very important point to be considered when you choose between the different options you have.
May I just support what Dr. Ghassan has been saying, that there is a problem with humanitarian work in general, and it was summed up by a German anesthetist to us under the title of Verschlimmbessern, which he said meant trying to do good but making things worse. And I think that's such an important principle. We already touched on inappropriate surgical techniques, but we can make things worse if we don't make appropriate arrangements for follow-up. We can make things worse if we discharge people inappropriately. We can make things worse if they're not fed. Many, many ways in which we can make things worse. And I think we do need to have some focus on that. May I just say I'm extremely grateful to be involved, but I'm very sorry I have to go, and thank you very much indeed for everybody.
Thank you. And I have to go back to my report. So I think we'll thank everybody for participating and attending, and we look forward to seeing all of you in Beirut in January.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Great.